May 8th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi pulls his aircraft up from the dive, his airframe riddled, his squadron gone. What died with those men in the Coral Sea could not be replaced on any shipyard schedule Japan possessed. The pilots were gone, the hours of air combat experience were gone, and the squadron cohesion built across 2 years of relentless drilling simply ceased to exist. Shōkaku absorbs 108 aircraft lost and 223 men dead or wounded in 2 days. Her flight deck is destroyed. She requires nearly 3 months of shipyard repair. Zuikaku escapes structurally intact. Her air group does not. Of 69 aircraft launched in the final strike, only 46 return, and a dozen of those are pushed over the side as irreparable. Japan's 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shōkaku, Zuikaku, were not assembled. They were grown. The Kido Butai was an institution built on carrier doctrine, deck landing training, and combat experience accumulated across years of war in China and the raid on Pearl Harbor. The force that struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, launched 414 aircraft across 2 waves. Many of those planes carried multiple crew members. The total number of aviators over Oahu that morning ran well into the hundreds, and not one of them belonged in a classroom. Japanese naval aviation training in this period was among the most demanding selection pipelines on Earth. Candidates washed out at staggering rates. Those who survived accumulated hundreds of flight hours before they were trusted near a carrier deck. These men had flown over China, refined their tactics in actual combat, and reported to the Kido Butai already hardened. That is what made the strike groups so lethal. It is also what made attrition so irreplaceable. Japan's training pipeline could not compress that timeline. It could not import the knowledge from an allied power. No such power existed with comparable carrier expertise. Every pilot the Coral Sea killed drew down a fixed account. That is the structural condition Japan carried into May 1942. On paper, the Coral Sea belonged to Japan. The Imperial Navy sank USS Lexington and damaged Yorktown, forcing American carriers to withdraw. Takagi Takeo's forces withdrew, satisfied. Japanese command logged the engagement as a victory and moved on to the next operation. Shōkaku had taken hits that pulled her from operational readiness, the full weight of that absence still unaccounted for in the fleet's calculations. Zuikaku emerged structurally intact, but her air group had been shot to pieces. Only 39 aircraft from both carriers' combined air groups survived the battle. Neither carrier would be available for the operation scheduled 26 days away. The operation was Midway. The date was June 4, 1942. Operation MI launches from a single structural assumption. Japan fields all 6 fleet carriers of the Kido Butai. The plan demands overwhelming air superiority. Enough strike aircraft to suppress Midway's land-based defenses and destroy the American carrier response simultaneously. Yamamoto commits 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. All 4 veterans of Pearl Harbor, all 4 carrying a combined 248 available aircraft. Shōkaku and Zuikaku are absent. The Coral Sea pulled them out of the order of battle, and nothing has replaced them. Nagumo's strike force arrives at Midway with 2 of its 6 fleet carriers simply absent. Shōkaku is in dry dock. Zuikaku's air group is too depleted to fight. The Kido Butai that Operation MI was built around, 6 carriers, massed air power, overwhelming numerical advantage, is not the force that appears off Midway Atoll. It is 4 carriers carrying the weight that 6 were supposed to bear. Zuikaku's surviving pilots scatter into remaining air groups after Coral Sea. The vacancies they leave behind cannot be filled in 26 days. Japan's carrier-qualified pilot pipeline ran on peacetime production assumptions that never modeled sustained attrition, a structural ceiling the Navy would collide with at the worst moment. The men who died at Coral Sea had learned things no syllabus recorded: how to coordinate strikes across multiple carriers, how to read anti-aircraft patterns, how to navigate the open Pacific. That knowledge lived in the men, not in the manuals. When the replacements eventually arrived, they would carry none of it. USS Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor on May 27, 1942. Damage assessors put her repair timeline at 90 days minimum. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave the shipyard 72 hours. 1,400 workers entered the hull and did not stop. Shipfitters, welders, and electricians worked from the original construction drawings without technical planning. Bulkheads replaced, deck plates restored. On May 30th, Yorktown sailed. Japan's intelligence placed 2 American carriers at Midway, Enterprise and Hornet, not 3. Station. Shaipo's cryptanalysts had broken enough of JN-25 to reconstruct Japan's operational plan. Yorktown wasn't sailing into a battle. She was sailing into an ambush Japan didn't know existed. At 0430 on June 4, 1942, Nagumo Chuichi launches 108 aircraft from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu toward Midway Atoll. His reserve strike sits below decks armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, positioned for a fleet engagement that Nagumo does not yet know is waiting for him. 1. Assign the northeastern sector where American carriers wait, develops a mechanical fault and turns back. That sector goes unsearched for 2.5 hours. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, hold position in that unsearched sector. His intelligence accounts for 2 carriers, not 3. The trap needs no deception. Only a malfunctioning scout plane, a dark sector, and Nagumo committing his reserve before the picture clears. Each condition holds. At 07:15 on June 4, 1942, a scout plane radioed Nagumo with partial information. American surface ships to the east. No carrier identification. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs pulled off. Land attack ordnance loaded back on for a second strike against Midway's airfields. At 0740, the scout corrected itself. 1 carrier confirmed in the American force. The rearm was already 25 minutes underway. Nagumo's first strike wave returned low on fuel. His combat air patrol had dropped to sea level chasing American torpedo bombers. He chose to wait. Recover the first strike wave, finish the rearm, then launch a coordinated attack. The logic was sound on paper. The timing was already broken. American dive bombers were airborne before Nagumo had confirmed a single carrier in the enemy force. The 0740 report from his scout identified American surface ships, but said nothing about carriers. That confirmation, 1 carrier, American, came at 0820. By then the rearm had been running for over an hour. Ordnance sat stacked on hangar decks. Fuel lines ran open. Aircraft were spotted but not airborne. The bombs hit at 10:22, 2 hours after the picture finally clarified, not 40 minutes. Nagumo had time. He did not use it. 3 of his 4 carriers were caught mid-rearm when the American dive bombers rolled into their dives. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, gone inside 6 minutes. The sequence he chose to run gave the Americans exactly the window they needed. Hiryu survived the first attack. She was sunk by nightfall. At 0702 on June 4, 1942, 15 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 flew into Nagumo's combat air patrol without a single fighter escort. Every pilot and gunner went down into the Pacific. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor from Hornet's contingent, watched from the water as Zeros circled overhead. VT-6 from Enterprise followed, then VT-3 from Yorktown. 3 torpedo squadrons attacked in sequence, uncoordinated, without fighter cover. Not 1 torpedo found its mark. The casualty count across all 3 squadrons runs above 40 men. VT-8's losses alone were catastrophic by any measure, with sources placing their dead between 29 and 45, depending on how aircrew versus pilot complements are counted. The numbers differ by source. The fact does not. The torpedo attacks accomplished nothing against Nagumo's carriers. They accomplished everything else. The Zeros chasing torpedo planes had dropped to wave-top altitude. Combat air patrol was strung out low and fast, caught flat-footed by the geometry of sequential attacks. The carriers were maneuvering hard. The flight decks were exposed. The dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were already overhead. Every Zero had burned down to wave-top altitude chasing those attackers. Every gun empty. Every aircraft climbing back toward altitude. Nagumo's flight deck sat packed with rearmed, refueled aircraft. The sky above the Kido Butai was empty. 35 Americans had purchased that emptiness at full price. At 10:22 on June 4th, 1942, Wade McClusky's SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived over Nagumo's carriers after extending the search past fuel safety margins. McClusky's bombers pushed over from altitude. 3 SBDs targeted Akagi. Lieutenant Richard Best pulled his aircraft into a shallower approach. He could not regain the altitude the dive profile demanded, and put 1 bomb through Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. 1 hit. The secondary explosions that followed were not caused by ordnance stacked in the open air. The strike aircraft and their weapons were primarily staged in the hangars below decks, not spread across the flight deck in neat rows. The bomb tore through into that enclosed space. Fuel, ordnance, and aircraft packed into a hangar, with no room to absorb what a single hit introduced. The explosions compounded in a space designed to concentrate everything needed to fly a strike. And that same concentration became the mechanism of destruction. Akagi's crew fought the fires. They could not stop them. She burned for hours. Her own destroyers scuttled her before dawn the next day. Kaga absorbed 4 bomb hits within seconds. 1 struck directly in front of the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior officers. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers under Leslie struck Soryu. Her magazine ignited. She sank in 20 minutes. 3 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, all veterans of the Pearl Harbor strike, were fatally hit within 6 minutes. Hiryu, running north, escaped. For now. Hiryu's commander Yamaguchi Tamon launches his first strike wave immediately. 18 aircraft vectored toward Yorktown at 12:05. 3 bomb hits strike Yorktown at 12:05. Fires break across her flight deck. She slows. Her crew fights the damage and brings her back. Yamaguchi launches a second wave. Torpedo bombers vectored toward Yorktown in the mid-afternoon. They find her. 2 Type 91 torpedoes punch through her hull and open her engine rooms. She loses power. She lists hard to port. The crew that had already fought her back from bomb hits could not repeat that miracle here. Yorktown was abandoned. A salvage crew returned on June 6th and worked her list down by 2 degrees. She was coming back. Then a Japanese submarine I-168 found her. 2 torpedoes ended it. Yorktown sank on the morning of June 7th. The carrier Nimitz's shipyard had resurrected in 72 hours went down 3 days after the battle that decided the Pacific. Yorktown, dead in the water, stays afloat. The carrier built in 72 hours of emergency labor absorbs everything Hiryu has left. His pilots have already flown twice. His aircraft are already damaged, and 24 Dauntlesses from Enterprise are already airborne and climbing toward him. At 17 Wasatch on June 4th, 1942, Enterprise's air group found Hiryu and put 4 bombs into her forward flight deck. The fires reached her fuel lines. Internal explosions tore through the hull through the night. By 02:58 on June 5th, Yamaguchi Tamon ordered the surviving crew to abandon ship. He refused evacuation himself. Hiryu sank at 09:12 on June 5th. Yamaguchi went down with her. All 4 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were gone, lost inside a single operational day. Midway cost the Imperial Navy roughly 110 aviators. pilots and aircrew confirmed lost across the 4 carriers. That number, taken alone, did not cripple the Japanese Naval Air Corps. Japan had entered the Pacific War with approximately 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews. The arithmetic of a single battle could not erase that. The men who had flown the Pearl Harbor strike and who carried the deepest institutional experience of the carrier force were not erased at Midway. Most of them survived. They would face a different reckoning, the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal and the Solomons later that same year, where the sustained campaign of air combat would eventually hollow out what Midway had left intact. What Midway did in isolation was something more specific. It removed 4 fleet carriers and their organic air groups from the order of battle permanently. The experienced men who flew off those decks were now dispersed or dead. The carrier units they belonged to simply gone. Coral Sea had already drawn down the cohort of veterans before any of this happened. Midway extended that drawdown. The loss was not total. It was concentrated and sequential. Each engagement pulling harder on the same limited tier of experienced men that Japan's training pipeline still could not replace on any accelerated schedule. The gap between the pilots Japan still had and the combat knowledge the force had just lost was a gap that aircraft and shipyards could not close. Japan's training pipeline couldn't fill those slots. The pre-war system produced carrier-qualified pilots at a rate built for attrition, not hemorrhage. The remaining experienced pilots were distributed across reconstituting air groups, spread thin across a rebuilt fleet, diluting expertise rather than concentrating it where it could matter. The United States was already moving in the opposite direction. In 1942 alone, the U.S. Navy graduated 10,869 aviators, nearly twice the output of the entire preceding 8 years. By 1943, that figure reached 20,142. By 1944, 21,067. It was a permanent, compounding divergence Japan had no mechanism to close. Japan built new carriers after Midway. Taiho, Junyo, Hyo, steel and aviation fuel, launched and commissioned. It is the flight deck crew turning aircraft in under 3 minutes. The air group commander coordinating strikes across 4 carriers simultaneously. It is the pilot who has carrier landed at night in heavy seas. That knowledge accumulated across years. Japan's accelerated training pipeline compressed those years into months. The pilots assigned to Japan's new carriers after Midway were younger, less experienced, and absorbed into frontline units before that compression was finished. Germany studied Japanese carrier design in the 1930s. Officers examined Akagi's lessons and never put a single operational carrier to sea. Graf Zeppelin launched. Unfinished. Blueprints crossed oceans. Carrier competence did not. What Japan lost at Coral Sea and Midway was not transferable by any industrial program Germany or Japan could design. June 19, 1944, Japan commits 9 carriers and 430 aircraft to the Battle of the Philippine Sea against Task Force 58's 15 carriers and roughly 956 aircraft. American F-6F Hellcat pilots, briefed on 0 performance envelopes and flying against pilots with as little as 3 months of training, tore through Japanese strike formations. Japan lost more than 400 aircraft in 2 days. Of 430 that flew, only 35 returned. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese pilots flying those 430 aircraft were not the men of the Kido Butai. They were products of the compressed training pipeline Coral Sea, and Midway had made inevitable. The Turkey Shoot was not a battle. It was an audit. Of every training hour Japan cut, every pilot lost at Coral Sea, every carrier deck that burned at Midway. Midway is where Japan's carrier fleet dies. Coral Sea is where its replacement becomes impossible. The distinction is not rhetorical. The point of no return sits not in the 6 minutes of dive bombing on June 4, 1942, but in May 7th and 8th, where Japan's experienced aviators die in numbers its training system cannot absorb. Shōkaku and Zuikaku's absence at Midway is the structural link. Coral Sea strips 2 fleet carriers from Yamamoto's order of battle, gutting the combat air patrol screening Nagumo's fleet. 4 carriers go to Midway to do what 6 were calculated to accomplish. The force arrives already subtracted. The subtraction happened in the Coral Sea. The consequence arrived at Midway. Those are not the same event. Japan's 4 carriers at Midway were recoverable losses in a narrow industrial sense. Shōkaku survived Midway entirely, and she would sortie again at the Philippine Sea 2 years later. Ships can be rebuilt or reassigned or repaired. What burned with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu on June 4, 1942, was not recoverable by any shipyard. At Midway, approximately 110 carrier aircrew died, 36 killed aboard the burning flight decks, 74 more lost in the air, the majority from Hiryu's final desperate strikes. Add the roughly 90 aircrew Japan lost at Coral Sea 5 weeks earlier. Together, around 200 men, pre-war trained, combat seasoned over China, veterans of Pearl Harbor, gone inside 6 weeks. No training program could compress what those men had accumulated. Japan's pre-war carrier aviation pipeline ran on long lead times and aggressive filtering. The Yokoren preparatory program alone ran 3 years, and the full pipeline from initial selection to carrier qualification stretched upward of 3.5 years for many candidates. Competitive examinations cut the candidate pool at multiple stages. The men who cleared those cuts spent years building the kind of proficiency that translated into combat effectiveness. That system produced quality. It did not produce volume. When combat attrition outpaced output, the IJN had no mechanism to accelerate without degrading the product. Japan began expanding its pilot training programs in 1942. The men entering that expanded system moved through abbreviated schedules, programs that cut down timelines their predecessors had spent years completing. Some wartime training pipelines compressed qualification into months, where the pre-war system had allocated years. The gap between what a compressed pipeline produced and what the front line required was not a scheduling problem. It was structural. The pipeline had been engineered for peacetime replacement rates. Combat at Coral Sea and Midway was not a peacetime replacement rate. Post-Midway Japanese carrier operations ran on younger pilots, accelerated schedules, and compressed experience. The flight deck still existed. The institutional knowledge that made them dangerous did not. 6 minutes of dive bombing on June 4, 1942. 4 carriers, 3,000 sailors. 248 aircraft gone in a single operational day. Every account of Midway begins there. The mechanism of defeat had been running 14 months before that, beginning May 7, 1942, in the Coral Sea, when Japan started losing men it could not replace. After Midway, Japan still sortied carriers. Kamikaze units killed thousands of American sailors across 3 more years of war. But at Santa Cruz in October 1942, Zuikaku's air groups flew with replacement pilots, who broke formation under fire and misjudged attack vectors that veterans would have threaded instinctively. At Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aviators flew textbook interception routes their American counterparts had stopped using 2 years earlier, and 395 of them died in a single afternoon. The pilots lost at Coral Sea carried irreplaceable knowledge of how Japan's carrier system functioned under combat. Their replacements arrived younger, less experienced, trained on a schedule that compressed years of pre-war learning into months. The Philippine Sea, June 1944, confirmed the arithmetic. Japan launched 423 carrier aircraft against Task Force 58. American F-6F Hellcats and shipboard guns destroyed 315 of them in the air. 50 more were destroyed on Guam. Of the 423 that flew, fewer than 60 came back. The Coral Sea killed the institution that could have made those numbers different.